Hello, welcome to my talk titled Korean Art from 1953. My name is Kimberly Chung, and I'm an assistant professor of Korean Literary and Cultural Studies at McGill University. I've been invited by Korean Cultural Center Canada to introduce, by online recording, a recent book publication titled Korean Art from 1953, Collision, Innovation, Interaction. This anthology was co-edited with my colleagues, art historian Chung, curator Sun Kim, and film scholar Keith Wagner. It was published in 2020 and has since been critically acclaimed. This book is the first anthology of essays that survey and analyze developments in Korean modern and contemporary art from 1953 to the present. And today I will summarize some key points made in the introduction of the book that was written by myself and my colleague Chung. I hope that this lecture will introduce the book and more generally Korean modern and contemporary art to the Ottawa and Canadian public. Thank you. The idea for this book began with what we saw as a surge of interest in Korean popular culture and commercial films. We noticed that in comparison to this rising popularity, there was a relatively lack of English language resources and scholarly materials about Korean modern and contemporary art. So in response, Chung brainstormed and initiated this project with the help of curator Sun Kim, me, and Keith B. Wagner. We then held a workshop with knowledgeable experts in the field, and this led to a 2-day symposium with the chapter contributors at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art with the support of Korea Arts Management Service. So through these events, over the course of a year, this anthology became fully conceptualized. So our main aim for this project was to gather top researchers and scholars who share a variety of critical perspectives on diverse developments in Korean art. And we also had a few conceptual target goals in mind. For one, we hoped that this collaboration could resist a regionalist reading. So we wanted to really focus on incorporating important global contexts, global cultural flows, transnational moments that really shaped Korean modern and contemporary art. So like the art of the Korean diaspora, like North Korean art after the division of the peninsula. So we agreed that a very important facet of Korean contemporary art was its globality after a certain point. Secondly, we hope that this project would introduce a new trajectory, a new method of Korean art criticism. So introducing a very cultural studies approach to understanding the interrelationship of aesthetic practice and the importance of socio-political contexts. The book anthology is divided into 14 chapters and 2 parts. The first part of the book is titled The Korean Avant-Garde, Modernism and Modernity, 1953 to 1987. While the time period does note 1953 as the beginning point, in the first chapter, that discussion actually really begins with the colonial period. However, we did want to give a kind of periodic mark to the beginning stages of visual art that followed the liberation of Korea from Imperial Japan in 1945, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and the division of the peninsula into North and South Korea in 1953 through that Korean Armistice Agreement. So in this first section, the contributors discuss the art movements and art collectives that evolved and flourished from these beginning stages in that post-war period to art production in the 60s, 70s, and 80s under a very tumultuous political climate under authoritarian military regimes during those 3 decades. The second part of the book is titled From Postmodernism to Contemporaneity in Korea, 1988 to the present. And we chose 1988 as a very turning point in South Korean contemporary history. It was a very important year that signified many things like the beginning of Korean democratization after the fall of a long period of authoritarian military governments. And subsequently, after this point, you have the globalization of South Korea, where Korean contemporary art becomes more internationally minded, as detailed in chapter 9 by Sun Jung's chapter on the Gwangju Biennale, Busan Biennale, and Media City Seoul. So while South Korea until the 1980s was experiencing social unrest in the name of democratization, a rapid modernization, Ji-Suk Hong in the chapter 7 titled Modernity in North Korean Art, Socialist Realism, Chosunhwa, and Photography, this chapter really describes a vastly different political context for artists in North Korea after the division of the peninsula. So Hong explains how traditional methods of brush and ink, Chosunhwa painting, gained a prominence over other mediums like oil painting because of the government's espousal, government's encouragement of the form, and how this Chosunhwa painting became married to socialist content and and became a nationalist form. And he reveals how this artistic expression becomes subsumed under the objectives of the political. So many, I think, interesting comparisons can be drawn between Hong's analysis of North Korean art and Yi's examination of South Korean photography during the 70s and 80s. Hong points out how actually photography in North Korea mimicked Chosunhwa composition in order to transmit the objectives of socialist realism. And I think this chapter gives rare insight into the development of socialist realism in North Korea and into how North Korean artists really negotiated a national art form in light of the development, the contemporaneous development of media and technology. Part 2 of this anthology begins with the important year 1988 that has become known as a turning point in South Korean contemporary history. The decades prior had been decades of political agitation, and the 1980s was really no different, but there are key changes that really identify 1988 as a turning point. So while authoritarian governments during the 60s and 70s had really had very oppressive policies. One facet of President Park Chung-hee's rule was a tremendous economic transformation. And the Chondowan regime that followed Park Chung-hee's regime wanted to showcase South Korean economic growth on an international stage. And so the 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics became such an important opportunity to showcase Korean success to the world. At the same time, the spotlight, the attention of the global mega event brought forth many changes. For one, it pressured the Jeonduan government to reconsider their global image. So it encouraged, really pushed the authoritarian government to finally concede to democratization protests in 1987. And so the 1988 Olympics were accompanied with the lifting of restrictions on civilians. So a lot of freedoms were beginning, like the abolishment of the pre-publication censorship that had remained in place for many decades, allowing for the importation of foreign goods, relaxing restrictions on overseas travel. So these new freedoms really paved the way for new global contexts, new contacts that led to a more internationally minded Korean contemporary art. So after the Olympics, a new government led by President Kim Young-sam launched a internationalization project called 세계화, meaning globalization. And Son Jung-kim, in her chapter, The Turn of the Century, Art in Korea in the 1990s, writes about how South Korean social, political, and economic development in the 1990s, and how the focus of art really shifted from national politics to everyday life. Kim describes how 세계화 policies not only allowed for the cross-cultural flow of mass media and goods, but also importantly led to an increase of artists returning from overseas. And Kim talks about Nam Jun-baek's retrospective exhibition entitled Video Time, Video Space that was really indicative of that. The symposium at the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Seoul in 1992, and the Whitney Biennale in Seoul in 1993 were very pivotal moments in contemporary art that show this new internationally minded Korean art. And these exhibitions were the earliest manifestations of a international exhibition culture that rapidly expanded in the 1990s. The 1990s were marked by many cultural shifts that arose from the 세계화, the globalization policies. And Chung and I, in our chapter, Postmodern New Generational Art, offer insights into the cultural, social, and economic contexts that provided and inspired a new generation of Korean art practitioners. So from the 1990s, there were so many changes, social and cultural changes. So the rise of television and advertising cultures, an influx of global fast food restaurants, high-rise apartments, an expanding popular culture, and a conspicuous consumption of Western culture. So all of these new cultural, social, and economic contexts inspired the work of the new generation of artists who contrary to previous generations, really embraced contemporary symbols. They found energy and allure in them, and embracing that pluralistic and consumerist zeitgeist, these new generation artists turned away from classical aesthetic standards and traditional Korean methods, and they reconfigured painting. They incorporated the body and performance into very interdisciplinary practices. Their work often pointed to a multiplicity of time, space, culture, and identity, inspiring a rapid development of Korean postmodern discourse. And this chapter explores the work, particularly of small collectives like museum groups, subclub, Tada, Nanjido, Metavox, and Logos and Pathos, as well as the work of artists like Ibru and Choi Jung-hwa. By the 1990s, cultural globalization had permanently altered the Korean art system, and the international exhibition culture documented in Sun Jung Kim's earlier chapter on the 1990s had expanded much further. So, this is an art work by Choi Jung-hwa. So in the chapter titled The Gwangju Biennale, Busan Biennale, and Media Cities Seoul, Co-Cultural Aspirations and Globalization in South Korea, Keith B. Wagner and Sun Jung Kim trace how South Korea joined this Biennale trade with the inauguration of the Gwangju Biennale, the Busan Biennale, and Media City Seoul in 1995, 1988, and 2000. Wagner interestingly describes these quote mega art platforms as co-cultural, and he talks about how they really embodied Koreans' quote increased sense of their own worldly encounter and that cross-cultural aspect of these events. Wagner and Kim also point to tensions between that process of cultural globalization and the work of the individual Korean artist who rarely was cognizant or operating on a kind of transnational level, or identifying with transnationalism. In chapter 10, titled The Paradoxical Place of Female Body Images in Korean Feminist Arts, Dong-yeon Ko, through a very insightful essay, talks about feminist artworks from the late 1980s. And I think we can think about John Berger's seminal book, Ways of Seeing, that set out how the female nude has had a very long visual history as an exploitative representation that compromises female sexuality. And Dong-yeon Ko reads the use of the female nude or the naked female body in these feminist artworks as a counterpart to the post-war female imagery in mass media. The female nude, Ko argues, is quote a window, and we can understand the changing strategies, the positioning of artists through the changing female nude, and how it reveals the gendered political context of their time. And so in post-war Korea, it was really that poverty and gendered labor took a precedence. But in the 1990s and 2000s, there was an adoption of Western gender discourse, and it provided the language for feminist artists to deconstruct, to criticize repressive mass imagery about the female body in a patriarchal society. And so Cole takes us through this time and also brings us to the present context where you have a decline of feminist activism and feminist artists moving in very different directions through an examination of works like by Park Young-suk, Chang Ji-ah, Hong Hyun-suk, and Seo Hae-young. In chapter 11, titled Contemporary Korean Media Art, Opening the Space of In-Between, Jung Choi lays out a very important exploration of Korean media art, and she chronicles significant artworks from the 1980s to the present, and really expands upon understandings of the conceptual frameworks, the paradigms of Korean media art. And she focuses on the question of media as a, quote, medium, from early works like artist Hyungi Park's, who really explores the material and the immaterial through the use of organic matter. Choi also explores Haemin Kim and Kim Byung-yuk's employment of the television as an interface between, quote, one world and another. New media has began to receive recognition as an art medium in the 1990s, and Choi discusses how works by artists like Chung Kim destabilize representational expectations, and really endows media through the work of contemporary Korean artists, quote, with a more integrated notion of sense. I think by Choi's chapter, we are really reminded of the aesthetic possibilities in media art. The last two chapters of the book examine international developments in contemporary Korean art. As I've highlighted throughout this talk, there have been so many sociological, political, and economic changes that has both stalled and also propelled the movement of people, especially during the latter half of the 20th century. And this movement of people has shaped the contours of contemporary Korean art. In chapter 12, Dislocations, Relocations, Contemporaneity in Korean Art, Yeonshim Chung and I discuss artists that were born and trained in Korea, but who actively worked and exhibited internationally from the late 1980s and onwards. And I think in a lot of these works, you see a lot of issues of migration, traveling, nomadism, hybridity, cultural translation, playing a big kind of thematic role. So artists like Do Ho-seo, Kim Soo-ja, Min Jung Kim, Sun Ja-ri, Hae Gyu-young, and Sung-won Kim are all works that inspire conversations about the movement of people and its effects on South Korean art. In Interrogations of Place, Korean American art in the late 1980s and 1990s, I talk about how Korean American art was first fostered from the latter half of the 20th century by artists who immigrated to the United States from Korea and really carved out a space in a new cultural landscape. So these foundational diasporic migrations led to interesting collaborative exhibitions in the late 1980s and 1990s and played a very important role in conversations about the racial frictions and American urbanization during this time. In this chapter, I introduced the intermedial artwork of Korean American artists like Sung-ho Choi, Y. David Chung, Byron Kim, Hyung-soo Kim, Young-soon Min, and Park Is-ho. And I think, looking at this body of work, these artists are highlighting the tensions between state-sponsored frameworks of multiculturalism, nationalism, and globalizations. And both chapter, the two last chapters of this anthology are focusing on how artists are differently addressing very complex issues of identity and conversations about local and global belonging. This concludes my talk for today. I want to thank you for joining me on this discussion about Korean art after 1953. I hope that this talk has inspired some interest in Korean modern and contemporary art. Thank you.